Liverpool. Um, so this is the first online event that we've staged, and we're delighted to have Professor Carl Rhodes to join us to talk about the experience of polarization. Carl, would you mind introducing yourself?
Certainly. My
Um,
name's Carl Rhodes. I'm a professor of business and society and technology in Sydney, although currently speaking to you from Bristol in the UK, where I'm spending a short stint here at Bristol University as a visiting professor. Um, uh, my research work is focused largely on the relationship between kind of business and economic activity and political activity, particularly democracy and the way, and looking in a sense at how in a liberal democratic society you have to manage a balance between a kind of market-based capitalist economy on the one hand and kind of democratic tradition of society on the other. My view is that that balance is way out of whack, and the business and economic factors are kind of increasingly ruling the roost. My most recent book, which was published in January of this year, actually January 21, the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, was called Stinking Rich, The Four Myths of the Billionaire. And I think we'll touch on that book today as well. But great to be here and great to be talking to you, Chris.
so why don't we start on that? So I'd be really interested in your how you found your animating question, as we sometimes say on my doctoral program. So you've ended by telling us your most recent book, and the book before that was on woke capitalism. But how did you
Yeah.
find your way into it in the first place? Why were these things important to you?
Um, it's really hard to say. I mean, I think I've always generally had a relatively strong sense of justice. And I think when you then see injustice, there's a desire, in a sense, to address it in some way. And people often ask me, embedded in the way that you've positioned this, they say, well, I see all these things of climate change and inequality and polarization and these kind of things happening around the world. What is it that can I do? And I think for each of us, the question then is, well, each of us can do very different things. And myself, as an academic and as a professor, I think, what can I do? Well, I can teach, I can do research, I can write. Those are the kind of special skills I've developed. So those are the things that I do. I mean, increasingly, in recent years or in the last 10 years, I've been writing a lot more for non-academically specific audiences, for academics in the group. Academics usually write research papers read only by other academics, and that's kind of part of the deal. But I increasingly wanted to talk to a broader group of people. So that's why these books have been written, and I frequently write for the press in various formats. So yeah, this sense of injustice, and then billionaires. This last book increasingly was something people were talking about, and it struck me as a good way to try and start talking more about economic inequality, because billionaires exist and they're kind of sensational. You watch Jeff Bezos getting married in Vienna and his kind of ostentatious shows of wealth. But talking about that, because it kind of has a kind of hook, allows you to talk more broadly about the economic inequalities that increasingly exist around the world. So that's kind of it. And I think times are changing. I mean, if I look at myself or even my father, who grew up in a very impoverished kind of background, he was a child to a single mother born in the 1930s. His mother worked in cotton mill in northern England. And at that time, as the welfare state was growing and education policy was changing, there were opportunities for people to do better, in a sense. And I also see all those opportunities less and less available for people now. So there's a kind of personal element to it as well. If I look at the life I've lived, which is a good life, which it has been enabled by a lot of factors that were made available by a democratic society and now we increasingly seem to have this winner-take-all polarized kind of view. And, you know, um, yeah, it sparks my sense of injustice. And then so I engage with it the best way I can.
Great. I meant to say at the beginning of this talk, but I got so excited to get going that this talk is just for an hour. You and I will wrap for about 40 minutes, Carl, and then we'll open up for questions. So if you have questions, you want to put them in the chat. Murray is assiduously looking at those questions as we go along, and we'll field some of them to Carl at the end. So what you were saying, Carl, about the sense of injustice is quite interesting in a way, because I've had the same reflection that I had a free state education. I emerged from the university system. I could find a job. I still had to apply for them. It's not that they were easy to get, but I could find work and I could get on the housing ladder. And none of those three things are true for my kids who had to pay for their education. They both emerged from university without jobs. And it was almost impossible for them to get onto the housing ladder. So one often thinks that the generation that comes after will have a better and improved life, the idea of linear progress. But that's certainly not been the case in the last 20, 25 years, has it?
No, not at all, not at all. And, you know, people increasingly talking about this question of intergenerational inequality as being a real issue for young people today. And I think you know, there is you know, we had a society that vaguely kind of believed in meritocracy, you know, that if you work hard and apply yourself, then you'll get on in the world. But that's less the case. I mean, people still do that and say, well, you know, people need to work to get what they want. But the kind of benefits that you and I had, Chris, weren't, frankly, they weren't because we worked hard. We were just talking before the event, before we came on, everybody, about students at university not attending lectures, and we were reflecting on our own perhaps haphazard attendance in our own undergraduate years. And so any success that we might have had, sure, the effort we've put in plays a part. But frankly, it's also down to policy decisions that have been made by successive governments. And the kind of policy decisions that have been made kind of in my adult lifetime really said, you know, a lot of the changes started with in the 1980s around what they call neoliberalism. These policy changes on a global level have reduced the opportunities that many people have. And we've got to the position now where when we talk about economic inequality, where at one time economic inequality would have conjured up images of poverty and homelessness and destitution. Now, those things are still problems. And in fact, in countries like Australia, it's a growing problem. But now economic inequality is also a middle class problem. And so more and more people are affected. You get a kind of hollowing out of the middle class, opportunities not available. So again, if you look at Australia, where not where I am, but where I live, you'll get people who are educated at university or are trade trained, have good jobs, paying well, but they can't afford housing, particularly if they live in capital cities. There was a survey recently done that showed that young people are increasingly deciding not to have children because they don't think they can afford it. And again, these are choices that societies have made. These aren't inevitable results. But it also means that there are policies that can be changed and things can get better. This is not a reason to give up hope. It's a reason to demand change. And I think that's increasingly what we need to do. And to try and, I mean, kind of part of my broader project, sometimes I like to think of it, is about trying to take economic injustice and make it equally important political issue as climate change has become, even though that's undergoing some challenges at the moment. But it's equally, it's a problem at an equal level, but one that's increasingly becoming realized, but not really being addressed yet.
Yes, I mean, you would think that this is in a way, it's an economic project that eats itself, because if you don't have the middle classes on board, then you're really in trouble as a political class. And I suppose that contributes to some of the dynamics we're seeing now with oligarchs dictating what can be said and buying power.
Yeah, I mean, the most, egregious example of this, of course, is Elon Musk. If you look at the influence he had on the US election, I think he put in, if I'm not mistaken, $288 million to support Trump, and you would have seen him on TV handing those big checks to people who, behaved in the way that he wanted. In the UK, you would have seen his support for Tommy Robinson, so supporting some fairly dubious far right populist kind of politics. He's intervened in Germany with his support of, again, the populist party Alternative auf Deutschland. Um, he hasn't yet tried to interfere in Australia. I was kind of waiting for it, but I think we're too small. He tends to like to focus on the larger economies when he does that kind of meddling. So you see these kind of wealthy people having the opportunity to divert politics. I mean, that's in that way, it's a very direct interference. But there's other forms that we don't see. You can see even in Australia, the richest person is Gina Rinehart, and she's been very overt in her support of the right faction of the Liberal Party. She's regularly seen kind of hobnobbing around Mar-a-Lago and refers to herself as one of the Trumpettes. It's kind of weird, but so you see, yeah, people with wealth influencing politics, and not even directly through politics, also through philanthropic efforts. You look at someone like Bill Gates with the Bill Gates Foundation. Now that the US under Trump has pulled out of the World Health Organization, I believe the Bill Gates Foundation is their biggest funder. So we have a private individual, purely because they're rich, having the opportunity to redirect global health policy in a way that has no democratic accountability. At least when politicians do stupid things, we figure we can sack them at the ballot box. When a billionaire decides to change the direction of the world, whether we agree with it or not, we just have to put up with it. It's almost feudal. It's like going back to in a European sense, going back to feudal times where rule was at the whim of the very rich. And I see kind of there's a democratic erosion that's part of it, of this as well, on account of this massive influence that billionaires and other highly ultra high net worth individuals is one expression have about this. So it's very troubling. But democracy, the word, demos, people, crassy, rule of, it is the rule of the people. So we need to remember popular sovereignty is what democracy is about, not the sovereignty of the very wealthy.
Great. I wonder if I can bring it back to you again. So one of the key themes of these two sessions are experience, and I'm wondering what it's like to be researching what you're researching in a business school. So just as an example, we know the famous example of Leicester University, who sacked all their critical management scholars. And I would
Mm.
say, as a process of attrition in my own university, all the critical management scholars, one way or another, have moved on or been moved on. So what is it like doing this kind of research in a business school?
Yeah, I mean that's a point, and I did work for a short period of time at Leicester University prior to a few years prior to those things happening. I mean, the one thing about being an academic, we have a strong tradition of academic freedom and the ability that we should be able to research and investigate and talk about whatever we want without political interference, or traditionally it was also about interference from the church. Um, uh, and as you know, until earlier this year, I was dean of the business school at UTS, and that when the book was published, initially I was just coming to the end of my term, and I think to some extent, at least in my experience where I work as dean, I very much focused on supporting people doing inquiry of whatever they wanted. That included inquiries of a political nature that I would have disagreed with somehow or been opposed. So I think that's an important tradition. I've always had a kind of iconoclastic streak, so I haven't worried too much about this. I realize it has had very material effects on some people, like the people at Leicester is one of the most significant examples. But in my case, I haven't. Well, there's been a few cases. Like when I was dean of the business school, some people asked me, how can you be dean of the business school when you hate business so much? And my response was always, I don't hate business. I'm not a communist. I'm not suggesting, revolution of the proletariat. My thing is, I think that business isn't doing as good enough job, and that things could be better. So a lot of my focus is on how things could be, like not just focusing negatively on kind of what's wrong with everything, but also what can change. How can we improve this? And especially when it comes to business. I mean, on the one hand, you'll have individual businesses kind of focusing on quarterly results, and you see some terribly exploitative behavior of both consumers and employees. But you've got to think of not you've got to kind of zoom out a bit and get a bit of perspective on what is the purpose of business more generally? What is the purpose of having an economy in a democratic society? And then you start to think, well, it's about providing people with good, stable, well-paid employment, where despite the fact that what's happening is worker precarity is increasing. It's about innovation and creating new and valuable products. We do kind of get profiteering. It's about creating economic growth, so everybody can share in a nation's prosperity. But what we're getting is actually inequality. So my view is not anti-business, but rather that we've gone the wrong way, and that we need to change that. So I do recognize that there are a lot of people who have literally suffered for taking these kinds of stances. I can say in my case that's not the case. And the other thing, Chris, is as I get older, I'm in my late 50s, as I kind of come to a point where I could contemplate retiring at some point. It's like, yeah, who cares? I'm just going to do it.
Yes, yes. I think maybe that's one of the things that we older people can do for the younger people
Hmm.
who perhaps might want a career in the academy.
Yeah.
I think organizations are more authoritarian more generally, and I've certainly noticed that in my own university. And
Yeah.
it's people, younger colleagues have been quite explicit about wanting me to take a stand that they can't or feel that they
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah. And I think there's an important, as you kind of get a bit more advanced in your career, to kind of role model certain behaviors so that others, everyone will want to follow that. It's not a Pied Piper, but to say that those who do have an inclination to work differently in a business school context, it's good that they can see examples of people doing that to give it a kind of legitimacy, and then there's the opportunity to mentor people. But if I look at my colleagues at UTS, there's people doing, younger academics doing some, amazing work around a whole range of social topics. I mean, sustainability and climate change is one example of a topic that at one time would have seen almost heretical to business. I mean, climate denialism is not along is not is in very recent memory. Certainly in Australia, we had governments doing that, and you have it back again now with Trump addressing the United Nations, calling climate change a hoax. But that now has become a very established and sustainability more generally, a very established kind of area of research and teaching in business schools. And if you look at that as an example, it's how you can take something that at one time politically contentious, and it can actually then build to become a more mainstream political issue, and also now an issue that's discussed on around boardroom tables. And that wasn't the case in recent history. So there's also, I think, to try and in whatever ways we can to try and influence public discourse around social and economic and political progress.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're interested in trying to get at really is these themes of inequality and polarization aren't just there in the abstract. They turn up in people's relationships on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you've noticed in your time in the university, how relationships between you and your colleagues or you and your students have changed as a result of these broader social processes?
Oh, I think that young people today, if I look at students coming into the university, are much more politicized, I would say, possibly than any generation since the 1960s. Not that I was around in that time, but I have a vague knowledge of history. So I think they are increasingly politicized. Now, as it is with young people, often that's kind of quite naive. And I think it's important for us as educators to foster that kind of political sense. If you think of this being a kind of, in terms of sustainability, this is a kind of post Greta Thunberg generation who grew up watching Greta Thunberg skip school to protest the climate. Now, but similarly, more recently, you've seen the whole debates around kind of wokeism and around cancel culture. That's been very divisive with people, and we see students coming in, existing on both sides of that polarization. But it is an opportunity to then to start to talk to people about politics, especially in business education, which is traditionally be seen as, teaching people how to operate the various functions of business, marketing, accounting, finance, management, and so forth. But I think that we have to realize that our role as educators is also about educating young people to be citizens, not just educating them to be workers, and therefore bringing these kind of political things in, which we increasingly can do. And I know that when I was dean at UTS Business School, we made a lot of changes to our programs and to core curriculum so that this was the case, and bringing questions of social justice and allowing it. So that's a kind of positive thing. On the other hand, we've had more troublesome political things as well, where we've had young men harassing female lecturers and then claiming that it's their right of freedom and speech, and citing Andrew Tate as their justification. If you look at the universities have been kind of embroiled in divisions over the war in Gaza, and that's been very divisive. That's a very difficult topic to talk about in the classroom as well, but one that we have to. So I think it's important to kind of understand. I'm kind of veering a bit away from your question here, but to understand that the role of education more generally, but particularly business education, to make people aware that business is not just a kind of economic function, it's very much political as well. And if you look at the kind of coming back to issues of inequality, that has been to some extent produced by business, that has been, unleashed by government policies to pursue particular economic agendas that have ended up benefiting some people significantly more than others. So these are all things I think that need to be part of business education, but also part of public discourse. As citizens, we should be talking about these things, which is kind of, why I was really pleased to be invited here today to talk to you and to the group who's with us.
Yes, I've had a similar conversation with my dean, who was developing a vision about the role of our business school is, well, it felt to me, and I'm probably exaggerating a bit, producing compliant corporate citizens who are
Yeah,
work ready. And I was trying to encourage him that actually the role of the university is about the German concept of Bildung,
mm.
actually producing more developed, active citizens who are critical. And somebody
Yeah,
could come to our business school, study for 3 years, and then decide they wanted to be a landscape gardener or a poet. And that would
yeah.
be a perfectly fine outcome. It's not about producing widgets for businesses.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be a time where they would say that working class towns here in the UK, that the schools in working class towns were producing factory fodder, just
Yeah.
producing, and it's almost as if business schools are just producing office fodder. And yeah, there's so much more to that in terms of character development. I was always pleased, and as I kind of meet alumni, I spend a bit of time, even still, meeting up with alumni of the business school. And in fact, I'm going to do an event with alumni in London here in the UK next week. And it is actually always pleasing to see what a wide variety of lives people who do business education and end up with. In fact, one of our graduates is an award-winning landscape gardener. I mean, he's a
Okay,
landscape
right.
gardening business, as it happens.
Right.
So that's so your example is not far-fetched at all. You know, we have another graduate in Australia who runs a very successful group of social enterprise restaurants, which entirely hire refugees as their staff. You know, one of our graduates, you know, graduates who are running major charities. So it's not all about kind of, you know, greedy capitalists, you know, wanting more than their fair share of the economic pie. Can and do produce people who go into very broad walks of life and profession, as they should. So yeah, I think we should absolutely encourage that. So I hope very much you win that debate with
It's
your dean,
lost.
Chris. It's
It's
like,
lost. It's lost, I'm afraid.
okay.
Can we go back to the relationship aspect of, you referred to neoliberalism, and one of the problems with the word neoliberalism, as one academic said, is it can mean everything that you disagree with. So
Yes.
it's quite a woolly term. But
Yeah.
one of the things that's happened in the UK, and I'm interested to see the extent to which it's the same in Australia, is because there's such a big financial stake now in students going to university, it has
Mm.
changed the relationship between teacher and student in the
Yep.
sense that it becomes much more a consumer relationship. I'm paying all this money. I expect X and Y, and I expect to
Yeah.
get a good grade because I'm investing a huge amount of money in this. And to a degree, that's fair enough. I mean, it is a
Yeah.
huge amount of money to go to university these days. So it becomes more about customer satisfaction than it does about what are we here to do, to ask questions, to
Yeah.
be so driven by the question that you go off and take yourself off to the library and find out for yourself what's going on in the world. How's that? How do you find that in your university in Australia?
Yeah, I mean it's very similar. I mean, even if you look at how universities kind of advertise based on graduates' average starting salary, that becomes a kind of competitive thing that universities use to attract people. So yeah, you very much do. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to a colleague here at Bristol a few days ago who'd recently moved and had been working in Copenhagen and had changed jobs and moved here to the UK. And she was noting that in Copenhagen, it's a city, and you know the universities are still funded, but students are still funded by the government, so they don't have this kind of economic exchange. And it's not like you got to give me something because I'm going to walk out of here with $70,000 in debt. Um, uh, and she was remarking how different the students were in the UK that she had encountered compared to the ones where she was previously, and exactly pointed to this. So, I mean, my experience is too that this is very much what students are looking for. Um, and I think it gets exacerbated, certainly Australia, by a school system which is so focused on grades and so focused on graded outcomes and so focused on assessment. We kind of get students coming in the first year who don't seem that interested in learning, but more just want to know what does the assignment is and how do I get the graded outcome that I want. Because if I get those grades, then it will enable to me get a different kind of job, which will enable me to have more money. That's not a healthy way, I think, to approach education. So I don't think everybody is like that. I think there are still many students who are engaged more broadly, but there is a lot of pressure on students to do that. And you know, and then every now and then you'll get the mother or father of some rich kid, you know, approaching you and say, "How can you do this? We're paying all this money. You need to do this." And you know, I often say your child is an adult. He or she should speak for themselves. I can't, you know, listen to you. So, yeah, that is definitely a strong force affecting education in many countries, certainly here in the UK and in Australia. But as I said, not all countries. There are still examples of countries where education is free. And in much of Europe, you haven't seen this broad, you know, I'll use the word again under advisement, neoliberalization higher education. But there's a lot of parallels in the Australia and the UK. The irony, however, is that part of the reason for this came from policies from the 1980s, which were designed to massively extend participation. So in Australia now, almost half of school leavers go to university. And so there's a question, how do we get more people to go to university so we can kind of thrive and have economic growth and build human capital, but the state can't pay for it anymore? So there was a bit of a kind of devil's bargain that was made back then that's yeah, arguably gone way too far. It's also a way of governments having to fund less. So it is, again, political choices leading to significant impacts on real people and, to use your term, their lived experience.
Yes, and I think that there's been a retreat of the state, hasn't there, from accepting the risk on behalf of society to push that risk onto individuals. So there is a lot at stake for people in finding a job, in taking a degree, in trying to buy a house. There's a huge amount of risk and a huge amount of choices to make, which creates the kind of uncertainty and anxiety, which is epidemic proportions.
And what's particularly troubling about this is that it's a much higher risk if you come from a lower socioeconomic background. So if your parents are wealthy and they can probably afford to pay your fees and they can afford to kind of basically underwrite your life, then it's not so much of a risk going to university, and you know, you've probably got a whole lot of other kind of social networks and cultural capital to draw on as well. But what happens for, you know, people from less wealthy backgrounds, from kind of working class backgrounds, people who are in low socioeconomic areas, people who are still first in family to go to university, then that's a much bigger risk because the debt would seem more extreme. And then you also get people, certainly in Australia, who will come full time to university, but have to work full time as well to help support the family. I was talking to one student a little while ago who, as well as going to uni and working full time, was the kind of almost full-time carer of a very younger sister that she had. So people who don't come from privileged backgrounds, they're the ones bearing the risk. And so on the one hand, we can talk about the effect of young people in general, and people talk about so-called intergenerational equality, but it's also important to think about intragenerational equality and the fact that not all young people are feeling the burden of this equally. And again, at the time you and I went to university, especially if you were in the UK, your fees were paid. If you didn't come from a wealthy background, you got government grants to help support living costs. And those were kind of educational policies deliberately designed to create class mobility and to kind of restructure the class system in that way. But now it's all, you know, it's all become individualized and it's all down to the individual. And if you're born with privilege and with advantage, well, you've just won the so-called postcode lottery, or you've just won life's lottery. And if you haven't, you haven't. And that seems to me not in the spirit of you know, the question of what counts as a just society, what counts as a just economy. These questions just aren't asked in the way that they have, and the way that kind of dictated much of the kind of progress and development in the 20th century. And I think we need to, I think bringing some of that back, as we're kind of doing in our own small way here, is important.
Yes. Yeah, and that's probably going to be my last question. I mean, just as an observation on the question of uncertainty. Uncertainty isn't evenly distributed. It's often pushed more onto the already marginalized groups.
Yeah.
And to a degree, they also expect it because that's been their life experience.
Yeah.
But let's stick with democracy, because that seemed to me to be the theme of your last two books in particular. And I was also interested by the paper that you have coming out or have just published in Organizational Studies on creating dialogic spaces.
Yep.
And that is what I think we're doing here in our own small way with a
Yeah.
group of people who are committed to this way of working. We have an experiential group after this for a limited number of people, but it's about creating the spaces where people can come together and think about questions of solidarity and
Yeah.
group membership and group mindedness. How does that form part of your intellectual project?
Absolutely central to it. I mean, in terms of democracy, for many people, they exercise their behavior as citizens every now and then when they go to vote. In Australia, voting is mandatory, so we have to kind of do that. In most other countries, including here in the UK, that's not so. And I think there's a kind of question of you don't just want to be a citizen, once every 4 years when you go and cast your ballot. We need to be citizens every day. And that means engaging with each other on political matters. And it's not happening. If you think about the traditional forums for democratic engagement, political party membership is tanking to all-time lows. Trade unions, which used to have, a significant proportion majority, I think, in many countries, membership have kind of waned. Citizens associations, clubs, that's kind of diminished. So we need to find new spaces to be citizens, to talk about the things that matter, to become educated, to learn about our own perspectives, and then to bring that out in terms of our engagement with the world. And in a
Yep.
sense, the internet, which we're talking on, is such a potential enabler of that. But again, not being used. I use social media quite a lot. If I, post my insightful political comments, I'll get a few likes. Post a picture of my dog, and I'm getting hundreds. So we need perhaps a kind of refocus, but certainly things like this. There, but I think this again is a reason for some potential hope as young people are engaging in social media, and the whole media landscape is changing, and there's a lot of opportunities that can be used there to increase democratic participation and engagement and citizenship. And that we're not just workers and consumers, we're political citizens.
Yeah, and I think that's a rediscovery of something we've always known as human beings and seem to have forgotten. So
Yeah,
often there's a kind of intimation that it's new technology that will solve this, but actually new technology allows us to do what we've always done as human beings, which is to come
yeah,
together in groups to deliberate about things.
indeed.
So I'm going to turn to Murray and Sophie to see whether you've been scouring the chat, if there are any interesting questions you think that we should ask Carl while we've got him.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, there's a few questions, but I think I might start with the most recent one that's been put into the chat, and it's maybe addressed to both of you, if that's okay. But it's from Chris Roche asking what the complexity angle is on this discussion.
I know nothing formal about complexity, so I will hand over to Chris with the comment. It's very complex.
Yes, well, I suppose I'll answer that methodologically. So it's something that I've already talked about in this discussion, that for a global phenomena to be present, it must show up every day between human beings. So there is a direct causal relationship between the particular and the global. And I suppose what we're trying to do here is to come to terms with the fragmentary nature of society and to do something in our small way to overcome it, at least by expressing bonds of solidarity and thinking about something important together. The other thing I was thinking about, came across an article just yesterday about the word polarization. I'd be interested to know what you think about this, Carl. There's a very interesting academic called Aurélien Manon, who I assume is French but works at Bath, who's written a paper with colleagues about the word polarization, which can suggest, well, there's this one extreme on the left and there's this other extreme on the right. And what we need to do is find a medium path between the two. And he said, if that's the case, then that's just supporting the status quo as is. And
Chris,
sometimes polarization can be helpful. Sorry, Sophie.
it's interesting, Chris. You are right on spot, because Murray and I are just going back and forth. Murray's about to post exactly this question from the audience. So Murray,
Okay,
you want to
good.
post it first and let them
Yep.
both answer?
I don't.
Yes. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Carl.
All right, go on, Mary. Go on. What was it? Is there a specific question?
I'm going to blend a couple of reflections together, but from Anne Moore and Darren Stevens, some reflections on the perspective of far-right politicians and how they're, seeing the changes that we're collectively experiencing at the moment. And I think one thing that I'm finding really interesting, building on that, and has shown up in the chat as well, is whether or not the language of polarization, the language of far left and far right, is helpful, and how that shows up for us. Darren said, can we counter these politics without far left or right labels? And the reflection that I think Sophie was alluding to was, well, is that helpful? Is that better? Or is it actually valuable to have the polarizing positions and views as a catalyst for something more?
Yeah, I mean, if you I mean, polarization operates on a number of kind of levels, and in many ways, it's exacerbated. So you'll get, you can listen to Donald Trump, who's in a sense constantly looking to create polarized division in order to gather support for himself. So in effect, the political polarization is used politically by certain politicians, and increasingly by more and more. So, you'll hear Donald Trump, for example, talk about, if you look at Zoran Mandami's electoral win as mayor of New York, which I think for many people of my own political persuasion was quite reassuring. But then you get Donald Trump saying, this guy's going to ruin New York, and calling him some kind of crazy communist. And, he's not a communist. I mean, anyone who has read anything about communism, if you haven't, pick up Karl Marx's book, The Communist Manifesto. It's a thin and easy read. Now, Mandami is not talking about the proletariat taking up arms against the oppressors. He's talking about social democracy and more fair distribution. But so political polarization is actually created by politicians who want to create division in order to garner their support. So yeah, it's not particularly, I would agree, it's not particularly helpful. On the other hand, if you think of economic polarization, where we have increasing inequalities and in many countries are hollowing out of the middle class, that's a very real form of polarization that affects people's well-being and means that some people can live, great, comfortable lives, and other people, can't put food on the table and can't afford to send their kids to the dentist. So that economic polarization is very real. And it's almost as if the political, certain factions of politics seem to want to exploit that for their own benefit instead of really trying to address it. So I think it is coming back to looking at, what are the real problems and what is that we want to do? Similarly, you'll see people now, it's happening here in the UK as we speak. You have various kind of social and economic problems, arguably, in my view, which have been created by this series of policies that have led to economic inequalities. Who should we blame? Immigrants. So it becomes a kind of platform for various kind of racism. You would have seen in Australia, the March for Australia rallies that were on the streets, and all of a sudden, blood is being spilt on the streets of Melbourne. So politically, it's very damaging, this polarization. But the underlying issues which have created it have not been resolved, and the political polarization doesn't resolve them. It in fact seems to make them worse. So there's got to be another way for us to deal with that as well.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable how the famous Overton window has shifted. The Overton window being, for those who haven't heard of the term, what it's politically acceptable for the public to consider. certainly in the last 10 years on race in the UK, mainstream politicians are saying things that would have been completely unthinkable even in the last 3 or 4 years, are now mainstream conservative politicians, not just the extreme right parties, but mainstream conservative politicians are saying things about race which would have been shocking even a short while ago.
Yeah. And again, I think, again, kind of my broader project in my own way is to contribute to bringing these basic economic issues and their political implications around economic justice and economic inequality more central central to that window, which I don't think, I mean, they are to some extent, but politicians are happy to talk about inflation and cost of living crisis, but it's an economic inequality crisis. Everything kind of gets a bit watered down politically. And again, to kind of broaden that sphere, we're not going to achieve that by trying to influence politicians directly, because politicians will respond to public sentiment. No matter how ideologically committed they are, there's still electioneering will still kind of run the roost and what will gather the votes. So it's about getting these ideas more out into the public, into communities, into the media, and not necessarily pushing one point of view or another, but to let the debate happen. And that is the nature of how democracy should operate.
Any other questions, Mari and Sophie?
You never asked me about my bad guitar playing, Sophie.
Well, I was just thinking that it's a monitoring of going wide and abstract, and we bring it back into the room to finish off, to prepare us for the experiential groups. So I guess my mind went to when I interviewed you about being a father, your own passion of music, and how you have to watch your son go through the academic career, and how we talked about how overrated these final exams are and the stress on the family and all of that. So I don't know.
Yeah. And I think in the end too, it is important for us, to think about ourselves and our families, not in a selfish way. I mean, otherwise, you just in the same way that you get the ultra wealthy people kind of creating better opportunities. But these things affect our own lives and they affect multiple generations. And it's important, I think, for us also as citizens to not be selfish about this, but to think about future generations and future people. I mean, one thing, I was reading an interesting book recently that was saying, one thing that keeps us alive is imagining that life will go on after us. If you think of kind of dystopian novels, for example, that imagine the end of the world, if we knew that the world was literally going to end in, 20 years, that would make we would change our own approach to our own lives very different. We live in anticipation of a world that will continue after we die. And that is also, I think, a moral responsibility that we need to bear in terms of having a stake in what the nature of that world will be. And on the one hand, it's easy to be pessimistic at the moment. We've got, climate change, the whole world will burn up. We've got kind of wars and weapons that can destroy the world. We've got economic inequalities, creating hardship for many people. And in a sense, that's pessimistic, but it also depends on how you think about pessimism, because pessimism is not the same as fatalism. Pessimism is imagining that the future doesn't look too bright and I don't like it. Fatalism is imagining the future looks bad and there's nothing I can do about it. So I think pessimism can also be a politically motivating force if we can at least mix pessimism with hope, mix pessimism with the idea that things, the way they're going, don't look like it's going to turn out too well. Therefore, I have to do whatever I can politically to change it. And I think that's the kind of political motivation that we need to avoid fatalism, actually to avoid optimism, because optimism is not very political. If I think everything is going to turn out well, that absolves me of any responsibility, because I don't have to do anything. It's just going to happen. So pessimism on the one hand can seem negative, as the word implies, but embedded in it is a political motivation and a kind of hope to do things differently. And I think politically cultivating that hope is tremendously, tremendously important.
Yeah, as Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yes.
I've just read a book by an Irish academic called Mara de Lucht, although she sounds as though she's Dutch by origin, called Hope for Pessimism.
Yeah.
Where she makes essentially the same point that, you know, optimism is just airy. It's candy floss. It's candy floss. Pessimism can be useful as long as it doesn't turn into nihilism or defeatism.
Yeah.
But actually, to take a realistic view of the world, what Melanie Klein would have called the depressive position, is to realize that the world is a tough place to be in. But nonetheless, what choice have we but to try and do something about it, and to try and do something about it now?
Exactly. And for those of us who have some kind of position to do that, and as academics, Chris, I think we still do, no matter how disempowering things might seem at times, it's our responsibility to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in small ways. I mean, Blake's famous observation is, if we are to love one another, we should do so in the minute particulars.
Yes.
So I'm also sometimes quite skeptical of large-scale programs for transforming things. I've come to hate the word transformation, because actually it's sometimes the small things that add up to the big things.
Yeah, and I think, and people who claim that they can transform everything, this is actually one of the things I write about in the book. It's almost as if they take on a vigilante persona, and you end up becoming like Donald Trump. I and I alone can fix this. Or even, you know, Bill Gates, one year he wrote a book on how to fix the climate crisis. The next year he wrote a book on how to make sure there'd never be a pandemic again. It's like, come on, it seems almost a kind of narcissism to assume that any individual can do everything, where really we need to be working together and not to rely on some pathetic great man theory of leadership that one person's going to solve all our problems, because that is what has enabled this kind of right-wing authoritarianism, far-right authoritarianism that's taken over in the US with MAGA. You saw it with Brexit here. Now Nigel Farage is a real contender for Downing Street. Look at what's happening in Hungary or what's happening in Italy. It's this kind of strongman politics of I will solve all your problems, but it's a smoke and mirrors trick that's leading us down a deadly path.
I would say that I think the business schools have contributed to that, in the sense of this hyper-inflated discourse on leadership, as though every problem in society is a question of leadership, and every solution to every problem in society is more leadership. And yet, after 30 or 40 years scholarship on leadership, look at the leaders that we get.
Yes, exactly. It's it's almost an inverse relationship between the two. I mean, maybe that's just a factor of the nature. But leadership is definitely not the answer. I mean, leadership's an important thing, but what about shared leadership and kind of communal leadership and the idea of individual leadership doesn't have to be such an individualized kind of, great man. And I say the word man deliberately, because the image of this singular leader is almost always kind of portrayed culturally in a masculine image of, you can see these pictures of Donald Trump, AI generated things that often, he and his followers produce, and it's him wearing some kind of Superman outfit, or certainly looking a little bit more slim and muscular than his real life physique look. So it's kind of keying into aspects of culture that aren't helpful around this idea that, some Lone Ranger character is going to arrive on a white horse, solve all their problems, and then disappear over the horizon, showing my age a bit there with the Lone Ranger. But you know what I mean? This vigilantism is not going to work.
I think that also involves us as individuals deconstructing our own expectations about what people in authority can achieve. So I think sometimes, the discourse is mutually informed, isn't it? So leaders come to think, of themselves, like Bill Gates, they can solve every problem in the world,
Yeah.
but also we come to expect our people in authority to have the power to resolve things that will be impossible to resolve.
Yeah, but it's also a kind of, on our part, if we're just kind of looking for some, superhero character to solve all of our problems,
Yeah.
it's kind of it's a fantasy.
Yes.
We're kind of building that kind of fantasy into a kind of politics, and it actually then ensures that those people can look at Elon Musk being kind of awarded a pay deal of $1 trillion a few weeks ago, because people think that he alone can do this, and he's going to make everybody else rich along the way. Again, it's the idea that one single person can do superhuman things. They can't.
Yep. I think we've reached that time where we need to bring it in, Sophie.
I've just got an idea. I thought maybe for the audience, if they can write to us and about something about what their takeaway message or any feedback or something, and send to Murray, and we will send them one of Carl's book from Complexity Salon. How's that? And you can tell us which one you want to read first, because I think it's helpful probably to read the first one too, don't you think, Carl?
I would encourage people to read all my books multiple times.
And before I let you
They're
go,
not
Carl,
dependent on one another at all.
I've got the Australian version of the 1998, actually. So you can't get it in the store, hopefully. 1998
Ooh.
Penfold. This is the Australian one, but because I'm going via Japan, I picked up this yuzu for you and your missus to make some yuzu spritz for Christmas, and I'll hand it to you when I see you.
You're very kind, Sophie. Thank you.
So yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you
Yep.
for everyone attending.
Thanks.
And we love your feedback, and we will send you a book. I will send you a book, or Murray will.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. It's been great rapping with you, Carl, and thanks very much for attending. Those of you have there's limited spaces on the experiential group, but we're going to have to take a 5-minute break and start on the dot of 9:05 in the UK and 8:05 in Australia for the experiential group. Thanks very much for coming. Thanks very much, Carl. It's been great. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Chris. Great
Yeah.
conversation. Thanks everyone for coming.
See you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.